All right, everyone. Great. So thanks so much for joining us for our event, Come and See, Reimagining Evangelization with Michael J. Sanem. We're very excited to have Michael here to talk about his new book. We're going to get into it, Becoming the Good News, out from Liturgical Press. So just quickly to introduce Michael, so you have a sense of where he's coming from. Michael lives in Kansas City with his wife and 3 sons. He's a former Bernardin scholar at the Catholic Theological Union, and he's the author of Your Church Wants to Hear from You. What is the Synod on Synodality? Which I recommend this if people, we still have a couple years on the Synod officially, and we know we're going to go beyond 2024. If anyone you know has questions about what it is, I'd highly recommend this. It's very readable and gives a great overview on the process of the Synod. Michael's new book is, as I mentioned, Becoming the Good News from Liturgical Press. He works in evangelization ministry at the Church of the Nativity in Leawood, Kansas, and he writes regularly at incarnationiseverywhere.com, which we'll share. And I also want to mention Michael is a contributor to Give Us This Day, which is a great kind of prayer devotional resource. And we'll be sharing a link where people can get a complimentary issue. So very good. Michael, welcome. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Michael. It's good to be here.
Great. I thought Michael.
Sorry, I just see some familiar faces. Hi, Dan. Good. Hi, Ruth. Hi, Tracy. Good to see you. Hi, Michael. Thanks for tuning in.
Excellent. Welcome, everybody. Thanks for joining us. Maybe we could begin, Michael, if you could just give us a quick overview about yourself and kind of your faith journey, whatever you're comfortable sharing. I know in the book you mentioned you've worked in prison and social outreach ministry, RCIA, and you've worked in all kinds of different parishes. So if you could maybe just give us a background of how you came to your current place.
Yeah, sure. So I born in Iowa, but grew up in Overland Park, Kansas, not far from where I currently work. My mom was a DRE, had a pretty traditional middle class Midwest Catholic upbringing. Went to a Jesuit high school. And that led me to a Jesuit college, studied a little bit to be a lawyer, studied history, philosophy, intending to be a lawyer, worked for a year in the legal field, decided that wasn't for me. I like to tell people my cubicle became a cathedral with all this religious imagery over the year. And, by the end of the year, it was, maybe I need to think about something else because I'm, tending to make a little church out of this space. So, I was encouraged to go back to my alma mater, Loyola University, Chicago, and work in ministry there, actually in the vocations office, which was Lilly funded from a Lilly grant. So it was vocations in the broad sense. What's your calling? It was both in the religious sense and in the broad sense. And I thought, well, this is pretty on the nose for me because I don't know what I'm supposed to do with my life either. So might as well help college kids figure it out. And I just rediscovered really through college, after college, and that just a real love for theology. Dorothy Day, St. Augustine, St. Bonaventure, St. Anselm, Meister Eckhart. I just fell in love with the Catholic intellectual tradition and the way that you were allowed to question your faith. I mean, if you read St. Augustine, he's just obsessively questioning everything. And I think for me, I came from a place of you don't ask questions about the faith, you just do it, and that never really resonated deeply with me. And I probably would have shrugged off my faith if I hadn't discovered that rich intellectual heritage. But then on the other hand, I was really drawn to Catholic social teaching and social justice works of the church, charitable works of the church. I mentioned Dorothy Day, who I think is just the perfect combination of that. St. Oscar Romero, the same sort of thing. So I really just got inspired by this and was able to get a degree at Catholic Theological Union through the Bernardin Scholars Program. And that was an amazing, incredibly formative program. First, if you're not familiar with Catholic Theological Union, it's a seminary for lay people, but also a lot of religious orders send their people there to be trained. So, the teachers from the Philippines, and you've got, 15 different maybe countries in the classroom, and we're all learning together. And it was just this incredible experience of a global church. And just to backtrack a little bit from that, in 2005, I was studying in Rome through Loyola Chicago. April of 2005, Pope John Paul II dies. And I had grown up with Pope John Paul II as the Pope, pretty much my entire life. I think my entire life, yeah. And so to be there when he died and see the whole world descend on Rome, it gave me this global, diverse, universal, even cosmic image of church that I haven't really been able to get out of my head since. And so anytime anybody wants to shrink or narrow the church, I resist that. I think the church resists that too. But that vision, it was the same vision I got at CTU, at Catholic Theological Union, that the church is bigger and there's a depth and a diversity there that is pretty much inexhaustible. So then I studied theology there, and then I came back to Kansas City. Me and my wife moved back home. I taught theology for 7 years at St. Teresa's Academy. Actually, I learned a lot, as much as a teacher as I did in my graduate studies. One, I learned from the students quite a bit, but also I was kind of building a lot of the curriculum as I was doing it. So that's when a lot of the stuff in the book comes from those years of trying to teach Catholic social teaching and ecclesiology to students well. And then that's when I got involved with prison ministry with Dan Dakotas, he's here, and Ruth. I had coffee with Dan, and we had a love of Thomas Merton. And I said, I'm interested in prison ministry. And he said, okay, well, come next Wednesday. I'm like, well, I don't know about that. that's too soon, And I remember going in the first time, I was pretty petrified. But what I experienced there was just this overflow of love. It was very much a sacramental moment for me to be in there with the Bethany group and Dan and Ruth and the Sisters of Charity Leavenworth, who had committed to that. So started in prison ministry there while I taught, and then left teaching for parish ministry and worked at the Cathedral of the Immaculate Conception, downtown Kansas City. And if you know the cathedral downtown, they've got a vibrant outreach to the homeless called Morning Glory Ministries. And they have beautiful liturgies. So that was very formative as well. And then left there in 2021 to do something similar but different, to take a evangelization ministry position, which was a new position here. And I was surprised that I was led to it. I was surprised that I took it. I'm still surprised I wrote a book on it. So I've just kind of been listening and following the promptings of the Holy Spirit throughout. So that's probably a little too much, but
no, that's wonderful. Thank you. I love the both invocation of Dorothy Day and Thomas Merton, who seem kind of like the patron saints of the 20th century that are pointing us the way forward. And the idea of the global church is something we need to really keep at the forefront of our minds.
Yeah. Even
That's
when we talk about evangelization, I know we're going to get into this, but the church is growing, and in the global South, we might be experiencing some diminishment here, but in the global South, it's springtime.
Yes.
So I mean, if you're going to go, it's growing worldwide, and so that's another thing to keep in mind, that this is very much primarily an issue in the West, and Europe's already really gone through it, and now the U.S. is holding. I mean, if you're just looking at numbers, which isn't the best way to look at it, but the U.S. is holding fairly steady. But the trends are there, and they're pointing, to something similar to Europe in the future, possibly.
And sometimes, that's what they get. Some commentators have, I think, miscategorized Vatican II as saying it was disruptive for the American church, and it's always through an American lens, where it really it helped the other parts of the world really bloomed because of it. So
it's a great point.
So maybe we can kind of build on that with just the idea of evangelization itself, maybe as a place to start, because I know, and we mentioned this in our event description, it can be a bit of a fraught concept for some Catholics, particularly. It has some maybe overtones. Well, first of all, some things in our own Catholic history that we need to reconcile with, of forced conversions and looking at people as sites to evangelize rather than build relationships with. And
Yeah.
it can seem to have this overtone of proselytization and things that maybe aren't kind of in the spirit of the gospel. So I'm wondering if you could unpack a little bit for us how should we think of this word, this idea of evangelization, theologically and practically, maybe some myths or misconceptions we might have around the term, and what you mean when you speak of evangelization.
Yeah, that's great. That's a gigantic question. So I've got a couple notes here, but I think the biggest misconception, and it's one that I can fall into too, is that you know, again, there's that old saying of like, the old fish passes by the two fish and says, "How's the water?" And the two young fish say, "What's water?" Have you ever heard that one? Right. So
Right.
I think it's helpful to know like what's the water we're in. And in the U.S., I think a lot of places in the world, in the U.S. in particular, we're very much in a culture where it's a consumer culture, and so people all day are trying to vie for your attention, and they're trying to sell you something. I think this is something when we talk about millennials and Gen Z that we need to be a little more savvy about. That they're used to being inundated by different competing interests, companies, corporations for their attention, for their money, for whatever. And so they've become very savvy and even a little detached, I think, because of that. But I think the big misconception about evangelization, just from that angle, is that evangelization is sales. We have a product, it's called Catholicism. We think you'll love it. Try it out. And I think most of us, rightly so, are not salespeople and aren't comfortable with that. And so that was the one thing I found. I also found that much of many of the strategies, not all, but many of the strategies were kind of outside in. They're out there, go get them, bring them in, let them show, what we have. And that's not, there's nothing wrong with that. I think there's a compliment there. But for me, I wanted to focus more on, well, what does it look like? I work in parish ministry. What does it look like from the inside out, from a parish? What can we do here as parishioners, as people in parish leadership? How can we focus on evangelization? So that's all to say, evangelization is witness. It's a witness. It was that from the beginning. It was a witness to a way of life. In the beginning, probably a much more radical way of life than a lot of us would be comfortable with, of following Christ, and witnessing to the spiritual reality that the church is the body of Christ. And so, what did that look like? It did mean that there was preaching and connecting and making sense of things. We see that in a lot of Paul's letters, Acts of the Apostles, but it also meant signs and wonders. It also meant radical hospitality. It meant living in community. Uh, you know, uh, David Bentley Hart had, I think, in Commonweal, an article. The early Christians were rabble. He's an Orthodox theologian, just kind of a provocative guy, but said they were rabble, and most of us would not like them, because they were just so countercultural for their time, but even for our time, that it would really probably jar us. Um, because they were living in this apocalyptic moment, and it's 2,000 years later, and we've moved from that apocalyptic moment to rightfully having to institutionalize and pass things on. So I'm not saying that we have to go back to that moment. We can't. We're in this moment, but they can still give us an example of what that witness looked like. And I just always think of you know the way that early Christians were derided for their beliefs. We have graffiti of a crucifix with a donkey head on it. I don't know if anybody's seen that, where they were made fun of and mocked by the Romans, but also the Greeks and the Romans, the Gentiles, they were impressed, because when a plague would come, the Christians would stay and they would tend to people who were infected, and many of them would die themselves. And we all were familiar also with the witness of the martyrs, which is what martyrdom means, to witness to the faith. Um, and so for me, it's less about what you say, it's less about strategies, it's less about programs, it's more about who you are and what you do.
Mhm.
And that's hard. That's hard for me. I'd love to run a program and say I've done it, and we're done. But this is really about like the title suggests, becoming the good news, because that's what people encountered when they encountered the early Christians. That's what I encountered in prison ministry with Dan and Ruth. That's what I encounter here at Nativity with so many parishioners, is that these people have got, there's some invisible reality motivating them, and I want to know more about it. You know, I was talking with a parishioner here, we're having lunch, and his kind of view of evangelization was, he does some work with a foster home out in Lawrence and some other stuff, is, you know, he would see people doing these things that looked incredibly difficult, but he could see they were filled with love. Think of Saint Teresa of Calcutta, for example. And the thing that drew him to them was, why are you doing that? You know, what you know, why are you, you know, if I go back to the cathedral example, why these people are lining up every day, and they're hard for the average middle class person to deal with, and we're feeding them every day, and we're clothing them every day, and people are getting released from prison and they don't have IDs, and we're doing this and we're doing this, and we're doing it out of love. We want to be Christ-like. We want to grow into this Christ-like presence. And so that for me is evangelization. It's holistic. The church, I think Pope Benedict said, the church is always evangelizing. If it's not, it's a club. It's a country club. If it's not always evangelizing, if this isn't just a natural part of our witness and our presence in our communities, you know, then we've lost the thread. So it's not a short answer for evangelization, because I did sort of, again, the book is sort of a starter of bringing a more integrated, holistic approach to it.
I love that word holistic comes up a few times in the book, and just what you're bringing out in this, remembering that history, that all this contravened the rules of logic. Why are these people doing it? And it begs the question why. It invites people to ask why, and then they can, then I can explain a little bit about perhaps the theology and the underpinning. Just when you were mentioning the prison ministry, it brought to mind the passage in your book where you say, you know, it was my experience in prison ministry. We weren't, quote, bringing God to people. We were discovering God together in our loving relationship with one another, which I think is just beautifully phrased. So
I remember. So I just share, the first time I went in there, I was shaking in my boots. You know, I was like, you know, the door clanged behind me, and then there was a sister of charity, and she was going in, and she was kind of hunched over her thing. You know, she was walking in, and somebody from the yard is like, "Hey, sister," I forget her name. "Hey, sister, so and so," and she's like, "Hi, Doug." You know, and I think, okay, I'm okay. You know, I'm safe. But I remember we went in there, and it was this. Dan was leading it, and it was on Lazarus, and Dan's opening question was, "Have you ever lost a friend?" Because Jesus lost a friend in Lazarus, and he wept. And once the first guy started talking, I could tell I was in the deep end. I could tell that, whoa, this is not your average scripture study. And when we left, Dan said to me, something like, "Okay, you're out, you're free. You didn't get trapped in there," you know, kind of joking. "We can tell your wife that you're out." Sorry, your friends are coming. And I had the funniest thought I had. My thought was, boy, I felt so much freer in there with them than I feel now on the outside. And that to me was that reversal that the gospel always talks about, you know, that the rich are poor and the poor are rich, right? And those in the prison are free, and those who are free are in some sort of prison. That unless you get that apocalyptic logic in there, unless you experience it, it sounds like nonsense, you know. But that revelation, that inbreaking of the kingdom that is always in the places we least expect. That was important for me to talk about, because I do think evangelization, there's a mutuality there. And I think even in my RCA ministry, I would talk to people and say, you know, one, I've never done this. So like your leaps and bounds, hey, I'm a cradle Catholic, so I've never, you know, I can't imagine what that's like. But I found that in working with people in that, and then people who had gone through the RCA process and become Catholic, that most of them came from one Christian tradition to the Catholic faith, so another denomination. But they didn't leave it and become Catholic. What they did was they became a bridge. You know, they really became this witness of Christian unity. because I don't know if it's possible to totally leave. I don't know because I've never been through it, but they became this bridge. And so even them, they were, evangelizing me. Some of them were so faithful and wonderful and so devoted to Christ. They needed to learn some more about the Catholic faith. But I think there's a mutuality to evangelization. Pope Francis talks about this a lot, the culture of encounter. And I also wanted to bring that up too, because I think when you're engaged in this, it being open to that you're going to learn something, that God's already here. And there's a mutual process going on of discovering each other and discovering each other in God that happens. So yeah, that's a great question. Thanks for
Receptivity. Yeah, that's a huge
yeah,
part of, being
yeah.
evangelized. Yeah, yeah.
I think there was a documentary just released by Disney of all companies. Pope Francis had a conversation, I think, with several young adults. I don't know if you saw this. Just came out maybe a couple weeks ago.
I heard
But
about it. Yeah.
they're asking him the hardest question. I mean, the high school teacher in me was kind of sweating, thinking, oh man, I've had these questions before. But he listened to them. He responded with compassion, with mercy, with sometimes just surprise, because the questions were so intense and the lives that these young people were living were so intense. But I thought, this is evangelization. But I don't think so, because he's not saying, quit doing what you're doing and get to church. He's listening. He's being receptive. He's not. He's defending church doctrine at times when he's asked pointed questions about it, but he's listening. He's really being present to them, and I just thought that was amazing. It's remarkable, and it was more courageous than I think that I would be to sit down and have a really hard conversation with some of them.
Yeah,
So yeah,
yeah,
but that mutuality, and he talks about that in Fratelli Tutti, that mutuality. And seeing society as this place of mutual encounter, and there's a richness there.
mhm,
Um, yeah,
yeah.
I always just keep
Openness to
thinking,
learn.
the church is not a monolith. It's not a monolith. Um, Parish ministry teaches you that, but any kind of ministry, I think, teaches you that it's not a monolith. And there's a lot of different ways to express being Catholic. Um,
Yeah, multiplicity.
yeah,
That might be a good lead in, Michael, because you mentioned him speaking with younger people. And that's a huge constant talk in the church about the decline of parish attendance. And it's always focused on millennial and Gen Z generations in particular. And it seems, we know that the narrative, young people are driven away for many reasons. There's, I think, foremost is the hypocrisy of the abuse crisis. I think younger people are much more attuned to authenticity, and they just don't have the appetite for what they've seen. There's discriminatory teachings on sexuality and gender. There's, I think the bishops in this country didn't really make a principled stand with Black Lives Matter and anti-racist movements. There's a lot of factors. So I'm wondering if you could speak to this question of the younger church, and there's a lot of hand-wringing over what we need to do to bring them back. Is it a matter of bringing people back, or is it, this might sound like a loaded question, but is it just going to where they are and joining them and taking up their struggle, their cause, and again, being, as you just said, being evangelized by the generations that are coming up? I don't know, any thoughts you'd like to share on that?
yeah, that's a great question. It's a big question. I think I'm getting ready to turn 40, so I like to think of myself as a former young person. But
The youth of
as
old
a,
age.
as an elder millennial, I don't think you can understate the effect of the abuse crisis. I don't think you can, because um, it hit, I think, shortly after either my confirmation or first communion. Um, and the hit that the church's credibility took is going to take a generation or many generations to recover. I mean, it just is. And so we have to commit ourselves as ministers to doing what we can to rebuild that credibility. But again, I just don't think you can understate it, because it was a lived reality for us. it was that parish. I think I talked about that parish, that priest, that this, that. I mean, that was unfolding during very, very formative years. And like I said, it really just crumpled a lot of credibility. So I think you've got to at least start there. That's the elephant in the room. If you're talking about why young people left or leaving, not that it drove them out, but the way that it hurt the church's credibility uh, as being just a viable option to be Catholic. Um, it, yeah, like I said, you just can't understate that. So that wound, and that came out in the Synod documents, which again, wow, read the North American documents. They're such an honest slice of the American Catholic Church. Um, I actually found them quite inspiring and how truthful and authentic, as you said, right? Millennials care a lot about authenticity, how authentic they were. I said, they captured it. This is not, nothing is whitewashed here. Nothing is manipulated. They captured of a slice of the conversations I have with a lot of different people about the church. It's not one-sided, it's multifaceted. So I honestly think those are some good starting points. But I think listening is the first starting point. And I mentioned to you before this interview, this thing I always recommend, this study from Kara called
Mhm.
Going, Going, Gone. St. Mary's Press published it. It's the dynamics of disaffiliation in young Catholics. And it's qualitative. So it's not like the Pew studies that are like, there's only going to be 2 Christians in the US by, 2300 or something like that, right? It's stories. And the stories they tell can roughly kind of be compiled into 3 different groups. And these are all young people, probably closer to my age than like Gen Z. This is from 2017.
Okay.
Um, but they talk about the drifters, the dissenters, and the injured. And the drifters are those who just stopped going. It wasn't dramatic. It was something they had to do when they were young, and then they didn't, and they stopped. Um, this is disaffiliation, so this is young people who've left the church. Um, the dissenters are those who you talk about. They had an issue with some kind of teaching, um, whatever it is, primarily probably sexual morality, gay marriage, abortion, something like that. One of the hot button ones. And then there's the injured. These are people who've been injured by people who represent the church, lay people, clergy. It could be parents, it could be teachers. In some way, feel like the church has injured them, and so they've gone away. So those are good. I think those are good starting points. You named some good ones as well. Um, I do think though it's kind of like it becomes this sort of self-perpetuating cycle where I'm talking about average parish ministry, when we get young people, we automatically ask them to bring more of them here, and they become kind of tokenized, but they also become, hey, I need you to go get more young people because we need more young people here. And rather than saying, hey, do you want to be my friend? Do you want, do you want to be on this journey with me? Can I accompany you? And American culture does this. It stratifies us by age. We don't have a lot of places for intergenerational sharing. It's just we divvy everything up by age. Oh, you're that old, you do this. You're that old, you do this. It's a different story if you've been to Italy or Europe, where the family is the unit and there's all kinds of intergenerational exchanges. Um, so I think that's one thing we do where we tokenize, or we might overburden them. We might, and young people are trying to figure out what they're going to do, who they're going to marry, if they're going to get married, where they're going to live. They've maybe moved 5 times in the last 7 years, and then we say, okay, your job is to go get your friends to come to church here, rather than letting them just be parishioner. Who wants to come once a week and just be fed and be nourished, and be with other people who want to celebrate the faith. So I think those are things that we do just kind of on the practical level. But again, I think there's I mean, I think there's reasons to be evangelized by the witness of young people. There is as you get older, you kind of get used to bitter compromise. You sort of kind of get used to having to gut it out sometimes and having to uh, take the world as it is. And
Mhm.
I think young people have always and will continue, to point to a different direction. They've got that. Maybe it's because their prefrontal cortex isn't fully developed, but God bless them, because it's not that they are refusing to compromise on something that is that important to them. And that's where, again, like I think a bigger image of God, the God of classical theism, which I talk about in the book also, the God of the transcendentals. And I would tell my students this, if you've got God in one hand, but you've got the truth in the other, I think this is Augustine, choose truth.
Mhm.
Because the God you had was just an image. Choose truth. Same thing with goodness or with beauty, right? Um, your image of God isn't God, and that the God we believe in, it's participatory. We participate in God when we create beauty, when we do good. When we search after the truth, the intellectual life, the sciences. Um, so that to me is helpful of seeing, um, I don't know, maybe some signs of hope, even within disaffiliation. But I also think there's an opportunity there for us, for me as a parish minister, and us as the whole church community, to say, why, why are um, the systems that we've had, or the strategies or the institutions, why are they no longer attracting people like they used to?
Mhm.
What's changed? And I'm not a big believer in, like, it's the secular culture that's evil, and we're okay. And part of that, I think I had a paragraph on this in the book, but I had to cut it. But part of that was the abuse crisis, quite honestly. Growing up in that, it was the secular authorities that brought the hammer down and encouraged the church to clean house. You know, it was it was not us self-policing ourselves that brought that wound, that sin, to light. And so for me, there's actually, I don't have as much um, distrust of the secular world as perhaps someone else might, because again, that was formative for me, that it was the secular authorities who were trying to follow their conscience and do what was right that really got us, the Dallas Charter and all that stuff, to really create a better, safer environment for us and for our kids in the
That's an
future. So,
excellent point.
um, anyways, I don't even remember what the question was. I get off on
No, that
tangents
was
sometimes.
excellent
Wouldn't you
point.
hate to be stuck in my classroom?
No, this is
Who
this is
knows where I'll
great.
end up?
This is great. Thank you, Michael. I see,
Yeah.
Father Joe, we have a hand. Would you like to unmute yourself
Yeah,
and say anybody else that has a question, please feel free to either put it in the chat or you can use the raise hand icon.
thank you, Michael, for that very good analysis. But my question is related to what is the language that appeals to young people today, the language. And I've been interviewing a lot of Catholic young adults in America, and they keep saying to me, do not use churchy language. Do not use churchy language. They said synodality is a churchy word. Use walking together. I'm a missionary who's been in Africa for 50 years. They say, do not use mission. That turns us off.
Mm.
Use service. That's the word that will appeal to young people. With all respect, Michael, they say, don't use evangelization. That's another churchy word. And so they say, use a fresh language that appeals to us. And in the video that you referred to with the Pope and those Spanish-speaking young people, inspiring, but they said the same thing. Don't use Latin. See, when we keep talking now about getting ready for Rome to put out the Instrumentum Laboris, why use that word? Say working document. So we keep shooting ourselves in the foot, I think, on language. So what do you recommend for how we can talk to young people and what language we can use, please?
Oh, thank you. Well, that is a great question, and I can see that it comes from a lot of listening. And I mean, in many ways, I feel like you've already got the answer to it, and in some ways, I agree with. This was part of the inspiration to write the book, because I think evangelization is a fraught term. So it was a way to present it in a like I said, maybe a more authentic, integral light. Um, I might push back a little bit though, and that's like I said, I'm a former young person, but I'm also in ministry as well. And I think um, I don't think we have to get rid of the language. I don't think we have to get rid of the Latin or the things that we use, or get rid of the term evangelization, or even synodality. I mean, it's going to be the teacher in me as well, or maybe the writer. I like words. I like rich language. I like things like that. I do think it's important that, I mean, I think kind of what you're talking about is communication, um, being able to communicate things in a way to where they can be heard. I mean, I learned early as a teacher that what I say and what my students hear are two very different things. Um, and so, I think uh, doing the work you're doing of listening, what language you prefer, and acting accordingly is helpful. At the same time, and this kind of does get into synodality, because one of the questions that we've got coming up, if we get to it on synodality, is, are we going to have a less hierarchical church and a more synodal church? And I think in the church, there's always room for both hand. Synodality and hierarchy are complementary. A healthy hierarchy is a synodal hierarchy. I think maybe there's some room for connecting that to your question, and just um, we can use the same language, because I've heard that too in evangelization, where people will say, quit talking about the liturgy, quit talking about this, quit talking about this. We need practical words for normal people. And that's fine, but boy, I would have hated, 500 years ago, if somebody went through and, scrubbed everything from the tradition that wasn't, relevant to that time. So I don't know. I think it's that balance of enculturation, of making sure that you keep the core of the gospel, but you also enculturate it appropriately. And like I said, I'm getting ready to turn 40. So as far as Gen Z, I mean, I'm as clueless as everybody else as far as kind of what language they prefer. So good question.
Thank you.
Yeah, tried for an answer there, but
I think it also speaks to the idea that, we hear a lot of younger people are gravitating maybe towards traditional iterations and Latin mass and things. There is a hunger for this kind of beauty and maybe elevated language. It's just, as you said, Michael, enculturating it in the right way, where it doesn't become a divisive thing or a fortress thing. It becomes,
yeah,
okay, this is where if this is really where you're seeking your truth, how can we honor that in a way that's not fortress-like,
yeah. I do also think, um, there's a gravitation of young people towards things that are stable right now. I think you do find sometimes the more traditional expressions of Catholicity attractive amongst younger folks who maybe grew up, without as many parameters as an older generation. And you're forced to basically create your self-image, create your brand, choose everything. You can do whatever you want. And it's all that. Well, that's kind of terrifying for an 18-year-old to look at, right? I mean, that only comes when you've reached a level of emotional, psychological maturity. I think also of prison ministry, where we would sometimes have some of the guys in there that um, would become very sort of rigid in their thinking. And one of the ways that we thought about that and discussed that was, for some of them, moving from the environment they were in, they grew up in, which might have been unstable, might have been abusive, to whatever they fell into, to prison. Well, prison really saved their lives, and the stability of prison and the rhythm of prison, and then a the law was life, if that makes sense. The law and the regulations and the rules that it put on them saved their life. And so that's where I'm hesitant to criticize any expression, like that, because for kind of depends on where you're at, I think, in your spirituality, but also just in your psychological and emotional growth as well.
That's
Which
fascinating. The overtones,
intersects with spirituality too.
yeah, the law is life. There's a lot of, that's a very rich phrase. Just thinking about the liturgical calendar and the rhythm that instills over the
Yeah.
year. Yeah, yeah.
And
It's
when I just fell in love with that too. When I was at the cathedral, I was kind of going through we went through the pandemic, we went through all of that stuff when I was working there, and I just fell in love with the liturgy and the liturgy of the hours. I had little kids, and it was such a balm. It was such a peace for my heart. You know, the world seemed to be going nuts, and yet, uh, you know, oh Lord, open my lips, my mouth was, I say it every morning, right? God, come to my assistance. Lord, make haste to help me. I'd say it every night. And that's where I hesitate to lose anything. I hesitate to throw anything out, because who am I to say that it's not rich for me, so it won't be rich for somebody else?
interesting. Yeah, it's very circumspect, and I think good way to look at it. Maybe we could pivot a little to this is kind of a new initiative here at TAC. We've been doing a lot with small Christian communities and kind of hosting some SCCs and trying to generate some reflections on SCCs. We see it as kind of a way forward with a more dispersed and decentralized church. And I'm wondering, in your own parish and work in evangelization, if you've seen how small Christian communities have maybe played a role in this, if they're a part of the evangelization process, and maybe ways of making parishes feel more like communities rather than these places we might go to and punch the clock once a week. I know, especially in suburban environments, they tend to be a little bit more, we might not be walking past them every day, or they might not be integrated into our neighborhoods in the same way. So how do we get that community parish balance?
Yeah. Well, I kind of walked into a situation here where a lot of those initiatives have already started. And here it kind of went, I don't know if you're familiar with Christ Renews' Parish, but that program created a lot of these small groups. It shrunk the parish for many people. They had really powerful encounters. We've got a great small group program. Tracy's right below me on my Zoom, at least, with our DNA groups, which are small groups that meet, monthly, couples groups, men's groups, women's groups. I think healthy parishes, though, are parishes that are a community of communities. I love that you use that phrase in the question, where it's not just this mass of people and then the pastor, right? I mean, it's just so easy to get lost in that, and that's any big group of people. If you can find a way to shrink it, it's powerful. But I was thinking of, just because I did some studies with liberation theology and inspired by St. Oscar Romero, and I've been to El Salvador. Just, I think of the small base communities in Latin America and the rich theological reflection that came from that. So that's kind of where I even get more excited about it, is that that grassroots theological reflection, right? Because that's when I think you get some really cool theological alchemy that expresses the faith in new ways. I remember reading John Sobrino in Chicago at my job at Loyola, and I don't get this guy. And I remember being in El Salvador reading, I'm like, I get it. I get there's no salvation outside the poor. I get it. But I could only get it in that concrete set of circumstances, right? So, that's where I love, is that then and that's what I like about synodality, because everybody thinks synodality's got some agenda, but the agenda is just, I think, to create these opportunities for this new richness, this new renewal to emerge. But that does not happen until you get the sparks flying from all these different groups and different generations, sort of, I don't know, coming together in goodwill, with honesty, with humility, with authenticity. And so that's what I kind of love about that. And I would say, if you know church history, that from Trent up to the First Vatican Council, and the synod documents say this, the hierarchical, I think it says something, the hierarchical aspect of the church was overemphasized, right? And you get that in the First Vatican Council. The Second Vatican Council, it hasn't been 100 years yet, so we're still trying to figure out all that the Second Vatican Council meant and means, right? It takes about 100 years for the church to appropriate and understand a council. I had a professor, John Markey, who's a Dominican. He said the Second Vatican Council was like an explosion. Yeah, so it was like an explosion, and we're still trying to figure out what that explosion meant. Some places
What landed where?
Yeah, what landed where, and where does it go? And so I think synodality, like I said, it's the complement to hierarchy, and it's the complement to a hierarchy that's structured. I forget which way it's structured, but we've already seen this in the U.S. We've already seen it with the abuse crisis, where you have both upward and downward accountability, right? Before, it was only upward, right? The bishop only answered to the pope, the priest only answered to the bishop, and the ordinary lay people only answered to the pastor or the priest, right? And that's the only way sort of authority flowed. What Vatican II did is, and this is another one of it reconnected us to the larger, richer history and the idea of the universal priesthood. That really the big sacrament is baptism. It's not holy orders or even like just Eucharist. It's baptism is that gateway to the life of grace, and it's because you're anointed priest, prophet, and king, right? And so that idea of the universal priesthood, and then the restructuring of the liturgy around that idea to have more active participation. But I think we're still, again, it was an explosion. We're still trying to figure out what that means for like ordinary parish life. What does it mean for everybody, that everybody's a priest in the congregation? That's still, I think we're still sort of trying to process, and that's gonna take a while. But these small communities emerge when the church needs them, and I think the church needs them now. It needs these small grassroots things. I've seen enough, I've started enough, I've done enough of these like top-down programs, and they're great, but what we really need is that grassroots organic energy, and we need them to meet, right? We need the top-down and the bottom-up to meet. And that's where, again, I think you have that real rich ground for discovering new paths forward. Well, Francis talks about this a lot. He talks a lot about the arts, creativity, imagination. I think so many of us, we kind of think more along the lines of, well, we just rearrange things, if I put this here and put this here, a little more analytic. He talks a lot about the imagination and the arts, and the importance of those, just not just spiritually, but just to be a human. And I think he brings that into the church as well. We've got to be a little more creative. We've got to use that God-given creativity to see new ways forward. So any group that makes the church smaller and builds those opportunities, I think is really powerful. I think of the Catholic worker movement, right? I mentioned the small base communities, right? I think of the first Franciscans, right? I mean, the first Dominicans. I think of all these orders that started, the Sisters of St. Joseph, the Sisters of Charity, just these small little groups, people that were answering that baptismal call. And I think we need more of those. I think we're all looking and saying, what are the bishops and the Pope going to do next to fix all this?
Right.
Not
and thinking programs, but thinking presence as you break down in your
Well, what are you going to do about it? What's God calling you? Spirit's active in your life. What are you going to do about it? Who are you going to do it with?
Right. Right. Tracy, I saw you had a hand up. Would you like to unmute yourself if you have a question or comment?
Well, I kind of forgot what it was, but I can always form a question.
Oh.
So I read your book, Michael.
Thank you.
And towards the end, you made some nice points about forming like your mission, like what is our mission as the parish, identifying what is our mission, what is, in your opinion, kind of the practical application of that? What does it look like for our parish to kind of form our mission and walk together? And then how do you form that mission? And then how do you communicate it and live it within a parish community? Like, what's the practical application of that? Because it's the right idea.
Yeah, that's a great question. And, I don't have the total answer for that. I was lucky enough to arrive at two parishes that, before I ever set foot there, they smelled like the gospel. They smelled like the gospel, but they were very different. Nativity and the cathedral, very different. And I mentioned in the book, the process is really what I just do is I apply the three key questions from Father Michael Himes on discovering your vocation to our life together within a parish. And honestly, be honest, I don't know, because I'm still doing that work at Nativity here where you go, where I work, of how does this unfold? And it's surprising to me how it unfolds differently to how I ever could have imagined it unfolding. And it's surprising to me who arrives, in my office or in my email inbox and says, I'm doing this, can you help me? And so I think I will say it's going to be different for every parish. Every parish has got a different culture. It's got a different history. It's got different groups of people. And every parish, I think, has different charisms. I think I mentioned in the book, mentioned here that, Nativity's charism is definitely welcoming. Definitely hospitality and welcoming. People feel welcome here. They feel like it's home, and parish is growing in a lot of ways because of that. But other parishes might not have that particular charism. Not that they aren't called to be welcoming, but some parishes are very mission oriented. They're very service oriented, I should say, is a better way to put it. They're focused on outreach or on serving the community, or some parishes might have a school, some might not. So that's all to say, I don't think there's one set formula, but I did mention in the book those three key questions. What's your joy? Which is different than happiness. What does your parish do well and delight in doing? What is your parish good at, or what gifts and talents do you have? What resources might you have? And then the third one, which I think we've done the first two well here. I think the third one is, well, what are the needs of the community? And the only way you get those is by listening, keeping your ear to the ground. What are the needs of the local community, the neighborhood? What are the needs of the city? But then what are the needs of the wider church, the archdiocese? I mentioned in the book, the cathedral has this vibrant outreach to homeless. That all started because the secretary started making peanut butter sandwiches one day, and it grew into this huge outreach. So like the question I ask in the book, what's your peanut butter sandwich? What's that small step? And that's really from reading the lives of the saints, because that's what our parishes should be doing too, is making saints. It always seems to start with something small. It always seems like, I think of Dorothy Day, her encounters that started small, her pregnancy, which literally started small, which was the sort of part of her conversion. I think of Oscar Romero, who, the encounter with the death of Retio Grant. That's pretty massive, but that thing, and then what's the next step he does? Well, then he just does one mass at the cathedral in San Salvador. That's the one mass he's going to do. And then suddenly, it snowballs. So I think of those, what are those small steps that parishioners and people can take? We're sort of doing that here. We're sort of getting into the realm of, in a lot of different ways, but one thing we're doing is we've been connecting with a lot of social service agencies, and we've been starting to help some young families, some single mothers with rent, paying electricity bills, getting cribs and things like that. So we're just doing these things and seeing, we're not really sure where it's going to lead, if it's going to create a bigger ministry, a bigger nonprofit, but we're seeing the needs around us and seeing how we are uniquely equipped to maybe help and fill some of those needs. Long answer. Again, sorry.
Seems like the mustard seed is the image for our time.
Yeah,
Remembering
that's
these-
it.
these
It's
are
the mustard
small. It has to be. I always think of Saint Teresa of Lisieux with just the small little way, and just these, because we talk in such grand scale sometimes, and our language in the church can be millennial, it's such a huge time scale. We have to just remember that it's really it's a single concrete action at a time.
Yeah, and it's always, it's also, so small things with great love. Mother Teresa. That's powerful. That forms you in ways that are often very hidden, but are lasting. So,
Right.
and they ripple out. You don't know who's watching you. You don't know who's witnessing that. I think, yeah, there's that quote of Pope Francis. I forget, that smaller church, right? Humbler and
Oh
more
yeah.
authentic. The church of the future will become smaller, lose many privileges, be humbler and more authentic, and find energy for what's essential. That might actually be Pope Benedict, or Pope Francis quoting Pope Benedict.
Mhm.
And a lot of people saw that and they thought, oh, good, it's going to be smaller. We can kick out all the riffraff. I think some people thought that. I don't think that was what Pope Benedict was saying, or Pope Francis. It's just, it could just be shifting demographics, but that doesn't excuse us from the gospel call to be doing good in the world, and going to those peripheries, as Pope Francis talks about.
Amen. Well, I know we're kind of coming to the top of the hour. I'm not sure if anybody has any other questions. I don't know, Michael, if you have time for maybe one more, or
Yeah, I've got time. Yeah.
okay, all right.
I don't think my son's going to baseball tonight, so let me just check.
If anyone has any questions, oh yeah, just make sure, because we want to. Oh, okay.
Yeah, we're good. I've got time for.
Good. Okay. So it looks like, Beverly, this will be maybe our final question, if you want to unmute. Oh, you're muted. There we go.
It's not really a question, but I've been sitting here and how both Father Joe Healy and now, are saying, get rid of the traditional language, the traditional, and I've had an experience in the past, I'm going to say 3 months, that has absolutely blown me away in some ways. This priest and I were in ministry together in a parish between 75 and 85. That was a few years ago. Okay. And I'm going to say we were very, I don't know what to say. We were very down to earth, normal kind of people, but we did the traditional things. Okay. Within the past 3 months, I have gotten more than 40 people contacting me through Facebook that were members of that parish, talking to me about how they wish we could come together again. Now, when we were there, 75 to 85, we had over 1,200 families on our parish list. When I moved back here in 2013, there were less than 200. And these people who are contacting me through Facebook are telling me it's even less than that now. There's no priest. It's just another parish where the two are joined together and the one priest serves, both places. But I'm just not sure letting go of traditional, let's say, verbiage. I think it's more witnessing to the traditional verbiage, be what you're talking about. And then, after you be it, then explain to the people why.
Yeah. And
that's where the traditional language then comes into play.
Yeah, I think you're spot on. I think that's very good. And
I feel real bad that the priest that I worked with is no longer with us. And as I'm getting all these emails, I'm saying, oh, Frank, I wish you were here so you could hear this,
Yeah.
Because I personally feel a lot of it had to do with him. But
yeah, that even that story you say, that is a reality at some parishes, that there's shrinking and demographics are changing, and I think all of us are, looking at the data and saying, okay, it's, it's going down, but that's again, another reason to, I don't know, in Ignatian spirituality, they call it indifference. It doesn't sound like a good term, but I think it can be a little liberating from, maybe a fear-based response. We got to get them back. We've got to do this recruitment study. We got to do anything it takes to, do this. I don't think that's the Holy Spirit, necessarily working either. But I think it's, in some places, some cities and some parishes and neighborhoods, it is, that's what it's going to look like for the next 25, 50 years, and that's a reality that we're gonna, if we're gonna deal with it, we have to accept it. If we're gonna create solutions, we have to accept it, and that's the starting point from there.
Dispassion, a little bit of dispassion, as they say, just to
I
accept.
think, I think it's easy to get worked up about it. We kind of talked, Michael, before it started, that there's a lot of great organizations out there, but there's also a lot of like private Catholic companies that talk to parishes and say, we'll be your consultant, and I mean, the consultant fees are like $2,000 to $3,000 a month, and we'll get all your people back, and so you kind of got to be careful of that we don't become so fearful and desperate that we start swearing oaths that we shouldn't, or predatory evangelists. We don't sign up with that kind of stuff, but I think it's important that we be good stewards of what we have too. But that's a lived reality, and that'll be a lived reality, I think, in our country for the foreseeable future. But again, in other places in the world, it's springtime. The church is growing, so we're witnessing. We're not witnessing. It's already happened. The center of the church is moving south. It's not going to happen. It is happening, and what Pope Francis is doing a lot is he's building a college of cardinals that reflects that, versus a Eurocentric college. So it's already, I mean, it's already happened, really. I mean, the center's already moved as far as population wise, but that to me is, what do we have to learn from them? What do we have to learn from the global South? There's a shocking little statistic. I found this on Crux, which is John Allen's publication webpage, John Allen Jr. And if I can think of it, we'll send a link out, but it was something like the number one indicator of mass attendance and religiosity per country. The number one indicator was per capita GDP. And generally, except for a couple exceptions, the higher the per capita GDP, the lower mass attendance and religiosity. So the richer a country, the lower the religiosity, right? And then the poorer the country, the higher the religiosity. There's probably a lot of ways to interpret that, but that's what the data suggests. So that's interesting to me, because just looking at the data in the wealthiest country in the world, what's going on there? That just makes me curious. I'm not here to offer a solution to any of that, but that's the main indicator if you wanted to predict mass attendance and religiosity, if that was your marker for evangelization terms or a vibrant church.
The luxury of disbelief, and the ability to kind of write it off, because you can could create your own.
Or this is where evangelization, right, is the good news, right? Sharing the good news, right? And that phrase, the phrase of the gospel that comes from Isaiah. I'm declaring, I'm here to proclaim good news to the poor. And that's the phrase that comes from. So the gospel, and that if you've seen Romero's tomb in San Salvador, he's being carried by 4 women who represent the poor, and they're each carrying 4 gospels. And the teaching is that this is the good news to the poor that he proclaimed and that he was killed for. And, that stuck with me. That was formative, like, whoa. So every time I bring up that word gospel, I'm not just talking about, I like to call it an afterlife fire insurance policy. I guess it's not just that. That's not what Jesus was talking about. That's like, being a Christian to avoid hell is like going to school to not get an F. It's absolute like lowest rung, it's the absolute lowest rung, lowest expectation. I have a little chapter on that, on hell and all that, but yeah, there's something more there.
Yeah. Well, I think that's a wonderful place to, a very meditative place to take that with us, Michael. I think that's a good place for us to proceed in prayer. And just thank you so much for joining us again. The book is becoming the good news, and this was the mustard seed image keeps coming back. I think a lot of seeds were sown in the book in this evening, and thanks to everyone for joining us. We'll have a recording up shortly, but thank you again.
Great, thank you, Michael, and thank you all for joining. Have a great evening.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good night, all.
Right.